Story title: The Swamp's Revenge. The swamp did not just breathe at night, it dreamed. Its breath was a low, wet sigh that stirred the beards of moss and made the mangroves shift their roots in the mud. Ologbo was not merely land. It was a living, sleeping creature, its skin a mat of water hyacinths and lily pads. Its bones the ancient, submerged logs. And in its heart lived the Watcher, a face of wood, worn smooth by centuries of humid air and devotion. Held 6 eyes of pure diamond. They were not cold stones, but living things. In the deep night, they pulsed with a soft, internal light, like the slow, steady heartbeat of the swamp itself. The old ones knew. They said the eyes saw everything. The guilty thought that flickered in a man's mind before the deed was done. The secret kindness. The hidden shame. They told of white men with greedy hands, long ago, whose boat was swallowed by a water that turned solid as rock. Their bodies later found on the bank, their own eyes replaced by quiet, staring pebbles. Hunters passing the shrine would sometimes hear not laughter, but a low humming chant that seemed to rise from the water itself, a sound that made the blood in their veins run slow and thick. But time forgets, and new hungers are born. Greed, they say, is stronger than fear. And time had birthed a new generation who cared less for superstition and more for profit. The diamonds were not just ornaments. In faraway cities, men in suits and uniforms whispered and spoke of these diamonds not as eyes, but as flawless carbon lattice structures. That those stones were vital for industries that held the world hostage. Aviation, intelligence, telecoms, drones, shipbuilding. Nations would bleed for them. Their value was measured in fleets of ships and the silence of drones. And so, the hunt began, a sickness reaching for the heart of the swamp. It found a willing vessel in Ologbo, the fallen priest, cast out for stealing from the offerings, using his magical powers to seduce and forcefully lie with married women who were not his. And not a few men who challenged him for snatching their wives disappeared without a trace. He now lived in a hut that stank of loneliness, immorality, and palm wine. The feud between Ologbo, the old priest, and Igbodo, the new one, was a cold war that had poisoned the shrine for years. Ologbo was old school, believing the deity's power was a wild, terrifying force to be appeased with blood and ritual. Igbodo was a reformer, whispering that the god could also be a force for community progress, for healing. Their final bitter break was over the Oyeni Ibiri oil promise. A slick oilman came, seeking the deity's blessing to drill near the sacred creeks. He offered a colossal sum. Ologbo, enticed by the wealth and the power it would bring him personally, was ready to accept. He argued the swamp was strong enough to withstand it. Igbodo, younger and fiercer, refused. He said the 6 eyes were not for sale. The confrontation happened before the shrine. Ologbo, in a rage, accused Igbodo of weakness. Igbodo did not shout back. Instead, he challenged Ologbo to a test of faith. "Let the god decide," he said. "Place your hand on the eyes. If it welcomes you, you are right. If it rejects you, well." Ologbo, pride wounded, stepped forward, but as his hand neared the wooden face, the diamonds, which usually pulsed with a slow light, flared into a blinding, painful white. A searing heat filled the air. Ologbo stumbled back, his palm blistered as if from a hot coal. The elders, witnessing this, and knowing his past record of sleaze and immorality, had no choice. Ologbo was cast out in disgrace. His authority burned away in a single divine moment. His thirst for revenge was not just born of humiliation, but from the deep, personal betrayal he felt from the god he had served his entire life. when the two quiet Chinese men found him. Men who pretended to build roads, but whose true talent was for taking things apart. He saw in their calm, empty eyes a path back to power. He would sell his god for a throne of money, but the prize drew other moths to the flame. Al-Haja, the Iron Woman of the Delta, moved in a cloud of expensive perfume and fear. Her wealth was built on stolen oil and the ashes of her enemies. Al-Haja had heard of the 6 eyes. She was as feared as she was admired, with a fortune carved from illegal oil, blood, and betrayal. Her militants worshiped her wealth, but feared her cruelty. They remembered how she once made an enemy drink fuel before setting him ablaze. She walked veiled most times, heavy bangles on her wrists, a perfume that could choke a man. She wanted the eyes, not part, not a share, all. She wanted the eyes not for what they could buy, but for what they represented, a power older and deeper than any she had ever known. She would wear them and become a goddess herself. And from the sprawling, hungry city of Lagos came the street dogs, Efe, Sharpman, and Yarrow. Efe, with a heart as hard as a bullet. Known as the Butcher of Echo City, Efe's infamy was not born in Ologbo, but in the sprawling chaos of Lagos. Efe was a debt collector for a notorious loan shark. His signature was not a name, but a mutilation. He was called the Butcher, not for killing, but for his precision with a knife. He would take a finger for a first warning, an ear for a second. His most infamous act, the one that earned him 3 years in Kirikiri prison after a rare arrest, was against a defaulting butcher in Yaba Market. Efe didn't just harm the man, he made him a spectacle. He held the man down on his own block and severed the tendons behind his ankles, the butcher's cut, crippling him. Efe was a man who believed every problem could be solved with the application of focused, brutal force. Sharp man, all sharp angles and sharper tongue. Known as the silver-tongued ghost. If Efe was the muscle, Sharpman was the virus. A master of 419 advance fee scams, his arena was the internet cafe and the fake office. He didn't just steal money, he stole hope. His most infamous scheme was the Canadian visa lottery. For months, he posed as an immigration officer, building relationships with over 50 hopeful families. He sent them fake visa documents and request for final processing fees. The day the families gathered at the Lagos airport believing they were flying to Toronto was a scene of such collective heartbreak and fury, it drew media attention. Sharpman had vanished, leaving behind a terminal full of weeping people and shattered dreams. He was a ghost who haunted the space between promise and reality. And Yarrow, the youngest, who still started at loud noises and whose dreams were sometimes filled with the green, quiet places of his childhood. Yarrow was known as the errand boy who saw too much. Yarrow was never the mastermind. He was the tool. A former bus conductor and street hawker, he was recruited as a lookout for a kidnapping ring in the Ikorodu area. His job was simple: whistle a tune if the police came. But during one botched operation, the kidnappers panicked, executed their captive, a young university student, in front of him. Yarrow, frozen in the bushes, witnessed it all. He was caught not by the police, but by the dead boy's ghost, which followed him into his dreams. He turned himself in, implicating the gang to escape the haunting, and served a short sentence. He was a boy, trying to outrun a memory, his conscience a raw, exposed nerve. They promised themselves this was the last job, the one that would buy their freedom. But the swamp had a way of twisting promises into traps. Watching them all was the prophet Onayemi, a man who wore faith like a fine suit. In his great revival tents, he held a Bible aloft, his voice thundering of hellfire. But in the shadows, he cupped his hands for money, Prophet Onayemi's past was a tapestry woven with holy thread and devilish designs. Before he had a tent, he was a prayer warrior in a back alley church specializing in financial breakthroughs. His method was simple. He would identify a desperate, wealthy woman in his congregation, prophesy a curse on her finances, and then, for a hefty deliverance fee, perform a miracle. His most infamous act was with a childless widow who owned a thriving pharmacy. Onayemi convinced her that her womb and her business were spiritually blocked by a marine queen. He took her life savings for a midnight prayer at the beach, where he planted the money in a box to multiply. The money, of course, vanished, and the prophet arrived the next Sunday in a new car, calling it God's blessing. He was a spiritual arsonist, setting fires in people's lives, and then selling himself as the only one who could put them out. He sold prophecies to all sides, whispering to Al-Hajjah of victory, to the militants of inheritance, to Ogidegbo of restoration. He was weaving a net of holy lies, planning to snatch the prize for himself when the blind, greedy animals were done tearing each other apart. The night they came was a night the swamp seemed to resent. The air was thick enough to drink, and storm clouds bruised the sky. The metallic whir of drones cut the silence, while boat engines muttered on the black water. They converged on the shrine, a convergence of greed, a pilgrimage of fools. The shrine waited, the 6 eyes glimmered, and in that faint light, Fa swore one of them swiveled to look directly at him. Sharpman spat. "This is Juju, but diamond is diamond." His voice thinner than he intended. Yarrow simply trembled, hearing not the shouts of the men, but a chorus of tiny, clicking sounds from the deep water, as if 1,000 armored claws were tapping against wood. Al-Hajjah stood like a queen, her veil a shroud, while Ogidigbo reached a shaking, traitorous hand to touch the wood he had once sworn to protect. And the prophet Onayemi raised his arms, his voice a false balm. "Thus saith the Lord, tonight the hidden treasures of the deep shall be revealed." The ground did not just shake, it softened, becoming a hungry mouth. The air grew thick with the smell of decayed flowers and deep mud. Torches guttered as if choked. In the periphery of their vision, figures flickered, shapes of men with heads tilted at impossible angles, women whose laughter was the sound of ripping silk. Yarrow screamed, feeling a cold, webbed hand brush his ankle. Yet, greed is a powerful blindness. They smashed the hollow shrine. The false diamonds, enchanted to gleam with a final, tempting light, were seized. The prophet Onayemi grabbed 2, his shout of dominion turning into a shriek as a militant's knife found his side. Al-Hajjah, in a cold fury, shot her own lieutenant in the back. Fa and Sharpman turned on each other, brothers in crime until the very end. Ogidigbo clawed at the stones, only to have his hands blacken and smoke as if held to a ghostly flame. The water, which had been still, now rose in a wave from no direction, swallowing men whole with a sound like a great wet gasp. But the deity was not in the wood they touched. The real watcher, the true 6-eyed face, was already safe, hidden miles away in a sacred grove known only to the true chief priest, who watched the far-off torchlights with a sad, knowing peace. The thing in the shrine was a decoy, a hollow shell. But the swamp itself needed no such trick. It rose to defend its own. When the dawn came, pale and sickly, the silence returned. It was a heavy, satisfied silence. The clearing was a mess of mud and broken men. The decoy shrine was a splintered husk, its sockets empty. But the story was not over. It was simply waiting. Prophet Onayemi, bleeding and mad, stumbled into the daylight to find his priceless diamonds had turned to common river glass. Yarrow made it to Lagos, but the whispers he heard in the swamp followed him, now living in the hum of his refrigerator, the drip of his tap, until he sat in a dark room, hands over his ears, forever listening. Al-Haja survived, her face scarred not by fire, but by a creeping black vine that had seemed to leap from the water, a mark she could never remove. The Chinese men and their drones were never seen again, and Ogidibo, the fallen priest, was found 3 days later, floating gently in a still creek. His body was intact, but his eyes were gone, leaving behind only dry, clean sockets, as if they had been taken by a careful, unhurried hand. They say now that if you stand on the edge of Ologbo as dusk falls, you will feel the swamp's breath on your neck, and deep within the gathering dark, you will see them, 6 faint lights, not in one place, but moving, watching. They all thought they were players in a game of power, but they were merely mice scurrying across the back of a sleeping giant, who for a moment opened one of its 6 eyes and dreamed them into ruin.